Okay, this segment of the norming and statistics set of lectures related to assessment focuses on validity. We have already spoken about reliability, reliability being consistency within an assessment, and there were various types of consistency. Scoring, consistency in scoring, and consistency internally to the assessment, and consistency among scorers. Validity refers to, does the assessment instrument measure what it claims to measure? We're in the field of language, so the question is, does the assessment instrument that we're using actually assess language? And unless we're planning to assess something else, for example, maybe pretend play or cognition, if so, then does the assessment instrument actually assess play or cognition? That is, does it assess what it's advertised to assess? There are multiple forms of validity, and the validity component of the norming process is very related to an area that I've asked you to give some thought to, and that is culture bias within assessment. So I'm going to try to tie the two in as we go along. What I want to do is review the types of validity, and there are a number of kinds of evidence that one pursues to support the validity of an assessment instrument. The first type of validity is, or the type of evidence is construct evidence. Construct validity is the type of validity that is often established or typically established when a standard norm referenced assessment instrument is normed. What is construct validity? Well, what is a construct? It's a couple of things actually, but one of the main things that it is an idea. It's a concept. It goes a little bit beyond a concept, which is typically about something observable. A construct is something that is created by the mind that relates to some observable behavior. So the different components of language are constructs, really. We don't physically see, we can open the brain up or the mouth up and pull out syntax or content categories or pragmatic functions of language. We don't just pull them out and look at them. In fact, they're ideas. They're really constructs. They are what researchers have conceptualized as belonging to language, as components of language. And then researchers go out and evaluate individuals to try to identify those components of language. But those things are constructs. So are information processing kinds of things that belong to that point of view about language. For example, immediate short-term memory, working memory. Those are constructs. There is something called closure, which is exercised as follows. If I say to you, p-at, what's the word? If you pull those together and say pat, you have demonstrated what some people say exists as a linguistic process called closure. Closure. Well, memory, you may think, well, memory is a fact. It's observable. Closure, you just observed it. You figured out from the separate sounds, at, that I just said cat, or previously at, that's pat. Well, these are really constructs because you saw me behave and you imposed upon my behavior an idea about what processes have been engaged. So the question is, do these constructs really exist, and are they measurable by the assessment? And usually, and do these constructs relate to language? Well, usually an expert who has done research in the field is hired to, or asked to, review the assessment instrument and make a decision. Are the constructs that are identified by the assessment instrument that are claimed to be measured, are they actually, do they exist at all? Are they real? And do they relate to language? For example, is short-term memory real? Is long-term memory real? Is there a way to, if the assessment claims to be assessing those things, are they accessible? Now, there was an issue with this construct business. I'll relate a story to you, and I'll relate a name to you, Donald Hamill, who's the president of ProEd, which is one of the largest company test producers in the world, and most profitable. ProEd, I'm sure you've heard of them. Well, Dr. Hamill was a speech-language pathologist many years ago, and he taught in Austin, Texas, actually. And there was a test when I was in school that was very, very, very popular, called the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities, the ITPA. And that was considered the cutting-edge assessment. And one of the things it assessed is auditory memory and visual memory. Auditory memory by reading, by having the assessor read lists of numbers to children, 7, 6, 5, 3, 8, and ask children simply to repeat them back. So you started with 3 or 4 numbers and ended with when you ceilinged when the individual was unable to respond to 2 or 3 numbers in a row, lists of these numbers in a row. Then for visual memory, there were these little cubes that had little nonsense figures on them, wiggles and hashtag signs and things like that. And those too were given. They were little cubes, or I'm not sure what to call them, like little Lego pieces or little cubes with these numbers, these nonsense symbols stamped on them. So again, a row of 2 or 3 or 4 were given to the individual. Then they were mixed up, and the child was asked to recreate the row in the order that they were presented. That was a way to measure visual memory. And auditory and visual memory were claimed to be part of language as it relates to verbal language and to reading. Well, the ITPA is no longer in business, or actually there's now an ITPA 2, but for many years, as popular as it was, and as important an assessment as it was in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, Hamill made the following argument. He said, close your eyes. He said, think of the number 7, 8, 5, 3, 1. He said, now repeat back to me, 7, 3, 6, 5, 1, or whatever I said. I repeated it. Then he said, are you only paying attention to what you heard, or did you try to visualize the numbers? Well, if you tried to visualize the numbers, then we were no longer assessing auditory memory, but at the same time we were assessing visual memory. But auditory memory, they said the construct was auditory memory, but the construct is not accessible because you can't split the brain up and identify auditory memory apart from memory in other memory as it's enacted in other modalities. Same thing with the visual material. I used to name them. I have no memory whatsoever, as you know. So those visual cubes, to remember them, I gave them names. So I used to name them like hashtag. Oh, it didn't have the word hashtag. It was number symbol. I said that was a number, infinity, whatever. And I gave them names when I was trying to practice taking that test. Well, once I name it, it moves from a visual memory test to an auditory memory test. And whether the construct of a memory belonging to a particular modality even exists is debatable. Thus, the test went out of business. That all relates to construct validity. Content validity is another type of validity, and that question about content validity is, do the items on the assessment, the actual items, actually test what the test claims that they are testing? Do the items tap into what the test claims the items are tapping into? If you buy into the construct, if you say that auditory and visual memory really exist for language, and that was brought into question whether they even exist as a component of language, but if you say they do and you pass muster on construct validity, do the questions or the items on the assessment actually measure it? Again, Hamill, related to what I just said, Hamill said no, those kinds of items can't. So the test not only has no construct validity, or at least the construct validity was questionable, that there is such a thing as auditory and visual memory, but that can be measured. But B, the item on the test that was given to the individual those items were not measuring what they claimed to be measuring. That's content validity. To the actual questions that are asked the client or tasks given to the client evoke behavior that allows us to assess that would allow us to assess the construct. Now, content validity relates to culture bias. How? Content validity relates to culture bias. I'll tell you how. Content validity, again, is about whether an item on the assessment instrument actually measures what it was intended to measure. And items are intended to measure both constructs or areas of knowledge or types of knowledge or types of linguistic behavior, types of behavior at a particular level of difficulty. Specific areas of knowledge at a specific level of difficulty. Well, if there are items on the test that are easier for some groups and more difficult for others, easier for some groups but more difficult for others, some cultures, some races, some people who live in one area and one location as compared to another location, then the test does not have content validity. The item does not measure for all individuals who take the test the same information at the same level of difficulty. Here's an example. There was a test called the Peabody test of PPVT, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. That was a multi-million-dollar assessment instrument that was used for many, many years. The PPVT. And it had pictures on, one picture that it had on it was of a combine, which was a farm instrument. Does anybody who is watching this right now, watching me right now, know what a combine is? Well, I happen to, strangely enough, have grown up on a farm, upstate New York. At the age of 4 or 5, I knew exactly what a combine was. They were in the fields where I grew up regularly. All kids knew what a combine was. It's an instrument, it's a big machine that's pulled by a tractor that cuts down hay, and then sends it along a little conveyor belt and bales it, wraps it up. So it cuts and bales hay. Now that's an item that anybody who lives in a farm would find very easy, and it's a familiar vehicle or grass cutter thing. But somebody who lives, say, in East New York on Atlantic Avenue, down around Troy Avenue or Nostrand Avenue, who grew up their entire lives in the city, would they have any clue what a friggin' combine is? Do you know what a combine is? Well, therefore, the item combine did not have content validity, because although it was evaluating knowledge of objects at a particular level for some people, it was not evaluating that knowledge at the same level for others. And that's an example of significant culture bias. When items on the assessment instrument are more familiar to some people than to others, based on culture or experience. Thus, content validity relates not only to validity in general, whether the test tests what it claims to test, whether the items test what they claim to assess, but are they biased to favor some groups and not others? Content validity. I'm going to skip across face validity, which simply means does the test appear at first glance to assess what it's supposed to assess. It's not very useful. It doesn't give you very much information. Face validity. Another type of validity is criterion referenced validity. Criterion referenced validity. What is criterion referenced validity? There's two types. There's concurrent validity and predictive criterion referenced validity. Let's talk about concurrent first and criterion referenced validity in general. Concurrent criterion reference validity involves comparing the results on one assessment that claims to be evaluating a particular construct with an already established other assessment instrument that is viewed as validly assessing the same construct. Again, typically a brand new instrument that's created is compared to an older instrument. And the same group of students, individuals, take the old test and the new test, and results are compared, again using a reliability coefficient of one sort or another. And if there's high reliability, that is a high degree of similar performance, then the new assessment instrument is viewed as valid as compared because it yielded the same results as the older instrument. Concurrent validity. Performance on a new or one instrument that measures something is equivalent to performance on another instrument, a more established instrument that is seen as validly assessing the same thing. Concurrent validity. So, for example, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test for many years was viewed as the standard test of the construct of picture vocabulary knowledge, which means you show somebody 4 pictures on a page and say, point to the cow, for example, and there's a picture of a cow, a pig, a duck, and a horse. Person points to a cow. Vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, receptive language, picture vocabulary. Okay? Well, a test that came out after the PPVT was the one-word picture vocabulary test, receptive and expressive. So the one-word receptive picture vocabulary test came out after the PPVT. So results on that assessment were perhaps compared to results on the PPVT. And if there was a high degree of correlation, then the new test, one-word picture vocabulary, was seen as measuring the same kind of construct as the older test, if you're following me. I'll tell you another story where this kind of validity was misused, and that is in the correlation that was found between picture vocabulary tests, such as the PPVT, and the verbal part of the Wechsler Intelligence Test for Children. The verbal part of the Wechsler IQ test and the PPVT results were highly correlated. Picture vocabulary, PPVT, intelligence, Wechsler. Therefore, for many years, when I was younger and starting out in the field, and working at a place called Willowbrook State School, which was an institution for children with mental retardation and other developmental disabilities. The PPVT was given instead of the Wechsler as an intelligence test, And in those days, anybody who did poorly on an intelligence test typically ended up in an institution, which is another story, but it's not a good place to be living. Well, is the PPVT really an intelligence test? Well, since then, the PPVT has really been taken out of business, although it's back again as the PPVT2, because the PPVT was tremendously culture biased, and the authors of that test were admittedly biased against certain groups. So that was a very problematic use of this idea of concurrent validity, but it is used to establish new assessment instruments as measuring, evaluating validly these constructs of comparative, more established assessment instruments. Predictive criterion validity applies to those assessments that predict something, such as the GREs are supposed to predict how well you do in school, in college. I'm sure maybe the praxis is to predict how well you do as a speech-language pathologist. In that, predictive, which is also criterion validity, what happens is performance of a group of individuals is compared with a measure of future performance. So in terms of the GRE, a group of people who take the GRE and admitted to school, their subsequent grade point average, for example, is compared to their scores on the GRE to establish predictive criterion validity, predictive criterion validity. One more type of validity is discriminative validity. Discriminative. What is discriminative validity? Two elements to that, a couple of elements to that. Number one, an assessment instrument is supposed to be able to discriminate between individuals with disability and typically achieving individuals. That's what these assessment instruments are used for. So typically, the language ones anyway, to discriminate. So analyses are done to see if performance of known individuals who are known to be, who are already classified as having a disability, whether a new assessment or a particular assessment discriminates between this group of individuals and individuals who are in typical, usually school settings. That is, studies are done to see is there a significant difference in performance of groups of individuals from who have already been identified as disabled, has been classified as disabled, and those who have not been classified as disabled, to see if these groups do significantly differently on particular assessments. That's one aspect of discriminative validity. Now, there's culture bias in this business of discriminative validity and relates to culture bias also. How so? Well, in designing an assessment, in actually writing one or designing one, most standard norm reference assessments are designed in English. They are made in America. There are not a lot of standard norm referenced assessments in the rest of the world, authored in any event in the rest of the world. They're primarily authored here in the United States. They're on English, typically standard, what is called often standard dialects, right? the Clinical Evaluation of Language Functions, or the PLS-5, very good sellers in English, have yielded or generated Spanish versions. There is a Spanish version of the SELF, at least the SELF-4, and Spanish versions of the PLS, Preschool Language Scale. There are Spanish versions. In designing that version, the Spanish version, the persons who designed that have a decision to make. Should they simply take the English version and translate it verbatim into the new language, or should they actually rewrite the entire exam, the entire assessment, and include items or refer to those linguistic structures in the new language that are discriminative of a disability, that when people have trouble with them, that suggests a disability. Because there's lots different, as much as I talk about universals across language, there's lots that are different. For example, in English, relative clauses, we know, and passive structures, passive forms of language, are definitely discriminative of disability. Kids with learning disabilities, language learning disabilities, typically have trouble with those kinds of linguistic structures. However, is that true for Spanish? Because there are other things in Spanish that are not ever on an English assessment instrument, because they're very suppressed in English. And that includes verb conjugations, the use of particles like anaphora, me llamo Señor Moses. That sentence is, I call myself Señor Moses, because that first me, may, part, that is and makes anaphoric reference. It's an anaphora. It's a particle. It's an anaphora, actually. We don't have that in English. We don't say, I call myself Dr. Moses. Well, you can, but it's a little awkward. I just say, my name is Nelson, or Dr. Moses. Maybe I'll tell you, call me Dr. Moses. But whatever. In other words, in Spanish, there are things that are not in English, and that may be discriminative of a disability, because maybe kids with language disabilities find these things more difficult than the things that English speakers find difficult in English. Well, those are my comments on discriminative validity right now. One more part of discriminative validity. Within an assessment instrument, certain items are supposed to be measuring one thing, and other items are supposed to be measuring something entirely different. For example, there may be some items that are meant to measure content, language content, and some syntax. Usually content is measured or assessed using a picture vocabulary format, either labeling the pictures or pointing to them, whereas syntax is evaluated on a sentence imitation format, usually. A sentence imitation format. Well, these two kinds of components are supposed to be measuring different things. They're supposed to be somewhat discriminative. That's another element of discriminative validity. There's also convergent and divergent validity, very much related to what I said. Some items on an assessment instrument converge and measure similar things. For example, maybe, let's say, the picture vocabulary components of an assessment instrument, and maybe the instrument has a piece of a toy or something that a child manipulates in a particular way to show its function, or has better yet, a item definition component, like defining words component. So it has a picture vocabulary component and a word defining component, and both of those are claimed to cluster as relating to semantics, evaluating semantics. Well, Convergent validity would be would relate to whether that's been established, that these things relate and measure some things that aspects of language that converge, compared to divergent validity, which would look to distinguish between items that converge on one type aspect of language and try to identify significant differences with items that assess other components of language that are supposedly different. For example, again, syntax items, which may be, again, sentence imitation items, and perhaps those morpheme items like one cat, two, and the child is supposed to say cats. Today I go to the store. Yesterday I went to the store. Well, that's another maybe way that should converge performance on the morpheme subtest, maybe should converge with the sentence imitation subtest, and diverge from the vocabulary assessment and the word definition components on the assessment. So you have convergent and divergent validity related to items that go together to measure similar aspects of language, to assess similar aspects of linguistic behavior, and distinguish those from items that assess different components of language, that converge to assess different components of language. So thus, convergent and divergent validity. All of these many of these validities, by the way, overlap to some extent. So I think what I said about discriminative validity had some overlap with some of this material. But keep that in mind. In any event, that you'll see these often used slightly differently across different assessment instruments. Also, please read your textbook. Please read your textbook and see what the people who created that textbook have to say about validity. I'm trying to get back my PowerPoint. The last item on this PowerPoint is prescriptive validity. And that would have to do with the use of an assessment to actually prescribe based on results, whether it's valid to prescribe intervention, a particular kind of intervention, particular intervention goals and procedures based on performance on the assessment instrument. And typically it is not necessarily valid to take performance on a particularly standard norm referenced assessment and make direct goals related to improving performance on those items on that assessment. That's not considered to be ethical, really, or supported by evidence-based research. Instead, these assessment instruments give you areas of language that will allow you to identify areas of language performance that are problematic, but how you have to separate yourself from the assessment and think, well, vis-a-vis what processes are these things acquired? What does the research say about how these aspects of language that are problematic for this child, how are they acquired? What behaviors are learned, that relate to ultimately the development of these aspects of language that were problematic on the assessment. So be careful about prescribing based on an assessment. In any event, these are my comments about validity for the time being, and we'll speak further.